Hi, my name is Murphy Griffin, and welcome to episode 18 of Neophyte Boatwrights. This is the second installment in a multi-part series on the planking process for the Newfoundland trap skiff. So let's get to it. So, as I worked through the planking process, I really started to think about it as broken down into two different parts or procedures. Boat prep on the one hand, and plank prep on the other hand. The first part was the boat prep, which in my mind meant getting the boat ready for the spiling process. Spiling, remember, is the overarching term for patterning out the next and newest plank. But in order to spile out that plank, you have to prepare the boat in a number of ways. First, you have to bevel the top edge of the oldest plank so that when you put on the spiling batten, that it will rest at the right angle. Secondly, you have to bevel the transom to receive the newest plank. There's nothing really sophisticated going on here. There's no bigger concept. But this is a very tricky part of the planking process. You have to plan out all of these bevels so you get the right shape and the right transition between each plank. And lastly, you have to cut the gains in the previous plank. So remember that the boat is being planked lapstrake. That means that each successive plank is overlapping the previous plank. So this is all good and well except at the ends of each plank. You have to come up with some way to transition them gradually from overlapping to being on top of each other. So that's what the gains are all about. So all of this will be discussed in detail in this episode. So it all starts with the lining batten. This is really the most powerful tool you have during this process. What it's essentially doing is modeling the way in which the next plank is going to lay upon the mould, stem, and transom. I made sure to make the width of the lining batten equal to the lap width, which is 3/4 of an inch, and the thickness of the lining batten to be equal to the plank thickness, which is 7/16 of an inch. So I failed to mention that actually the first thing that you're going to do in this process is make sure to bevel all the molds so that the lining batten lays flush against them. As you can see here, the lining batten clamped against the first mold is only touching the forward face of the mold as you would expect. To figure out the bevel at the mold, I went with the following technique. First, I measured the distance between the aftward face of the mold and the lining batten. I then projected this measurement to the forward face of the mold and connected it with a line that was parallel to the face of the lower plank. Using these two marks as guides, I could then cut the bevel into the mold. The most important thing to remember with the bevel is that you want to keep the aftward edge of this mold intact. You don't want to lose any of that material. Otherwise, you just have to try to envision exactly how this plank is going to be hitting the mold. I generally found a sort of triangular shaped bevel to be the best fit. And so from here, you just carry on and bevel all the molds as needed. Remembering that you have to sort of flip-flop this process once you get aft of the middle station mold. So now with the molds beveled, we can look at the plank beveling. So as I've stated before, the idea behind beveling the planks is essentially to cooper out the shape of the hull. Therefore, the angles of the plank bevels is determined by the shape of the molds. But there's one issue, which is how do you determine the bevels between the molds? Ideally, what you're aiming to do is interpolate the plank bevel in a continuous and smooth way between each pair of successive molds. In order to figure out what that smooth bevel ought to be between each pair of molds, we'll use this tool, the bevel gauge. Now this bevel gauge isn't terribly sophisticated. It only has two important features. One, it has a right angle notch whose depth is equal to the thickness of the planking. Two, the edge below the notch is nice and flat and straight. With this bevel gauge and the lining batten in position, we can interpolate the rolling bevel between each pair of molds. To use the bevel gauge, you slot the notch under the lining batten and rest the gauge on the plank edge below. You can then observe the gap between the edge of the gauge and the lap line. Note that the lap line has been marked all along the top edge of the bottom plank. So you then bevel the top edge of the bottom plank with a block plane until the edge of the gauge is lying flush down to the lap line. This has to be done down the whole length of the top edge of the bottom plank. The great thing about using a bevel gauge for this process is that you can then slide the gauge along the batten to check the run of the bevel. So this gives you a sort of continuous and instantaneous way of checking the shape of the bevel all along the top edge of the plank. Now there is a case when the bevel gauge doesn't work, and that's when the concavity of the mold changes from concave in to concave out. When the concavity of the mold changes, the bevel goes from the top outside edge of the bottom plank to the bottom inside edge of the top plank. We will call this a back bevel. The only method I came up with to help find this bevel was by using the next plank itself as a gauge. Assuming for an instance you already have the next plank spiled and cut out, you can then clamp it in position and measure the gap between the edges of the two planks. I did this at several locations along the planks, recording each measurement as I went. I then took the plank back to the bench and sketched the bevel on the edge of the plank, simply interpolating the bevel between the measured points. The following animation shows you how theoretically the back beveling works. Now with the bevels cut out, it's time to turn to the gains. So the idea behind the gains is to essentially crossfade the ends of each pair of successive planks together. Again, it's all about taking the two planks from where they're overlapping to where they're flush with one another at the very ends of the boat. Now there are two common strategies to cutting the gains, the ship lap and the dory lap. So what you're seeing here is the cross section of the ship lap joint as you scan from the very beginning of the gain to the end of the gain at the end of the boat. Notice that as you start, the two planks are directly overlapping one another. But once you progress to the end of the ship lap, the end of the gain, the two planks are right on top of each other. With the ship lap, you're cutting a pair of complementary ramping rabbets. One of the rabbets on the top outside edge of the bottom plank, and the other on the bottom inside edge of the top plank. Laying out and cutting the ship laps was fairly straightforward. I decided to cut my gains 18 inches long. I then divided that length into quarters. Then, along the top edge of the plank, I drew a series of connected sloping lines, each one gaining a 1/16 of an inch for every 4.5 inches of run. I then could use these lines as an approximation of the ship lap. All I would do is follow it with my rabbet plane, making sure never to exceed these lines, but letting the curvature of the plank determine the cut. To cut the shiplap, I used a modified rabbet plane. This little shop-made fence I made served two functions. First, it controlled the width of the rabbet so I was cutting exactly 3/4 of an inch into the top edge of the plank. Secondly, it allowed me to run the rabbet plane along the narrow top edge of the plank all the way up to where the plank and the stem meet. All in all, with the help of this shop-made fence, cutting the shiplaps was fairly straightforward. Of course, once the next plank is spiled and cut out, you will have to cut the complementary rabbet in the bottom edge of that plank. There's fundamentally nothing new here except that you're cutting the rabbet while the plank is on the bench as opposed to while it's on the boat. I'll make sure to talk about this again in the next episode. Next up is the dory lap. Here, instead of cutting a pair of complementary ramping rabbets, you're instead cutting a pair of complementary rolling bevels. Nevertheless, the end result is the same as with the shiplap. You're taking the two planks from overlapping to abutting one another. Now, as far as layout is concerned, the dory lap really is no different than the shiplap. The difference instead is how you cut to the lines that you've marked. So instead of rabbets, with the dory lap, you're carving rolling bevels between the guidelines. This is best done with a chisel. So there's one last important consideration before we can close the book on the gains. Namely that you have to transition the plank bevels smoothly into the gains at the forward and the aft ends of the boat. This requires some careful plane and chisel work. Whatever you do during this process, make sure to respect whatever the bevel gauge is telling you. It's really your best tool here. So in my opinion, the shiplap and the dory lap both have their advantages and their disadvantages. I found the shiplap best suited for the forward end of the boat, whereas the dory lap was better suited for the aft end of the boat where there was more curvature and twist. So getting a handle on the gains now allows us to tackle the transom bevels. So the mechanics of cutting the transom bevels was pretty straightforward. I started by cutting a stop cut for the top, and then cleared away the rest of the material between the inboard and outboard transom lines however I saw fit. I tried using a belt sander once, but in the end I found that good old-fashioned chiseling was really the best bet. The real tricky part is laying out the bevel lines. Now, while in the original lofting the inboard and outboard transom lines were smooth, fair curves, the actual bevel lines are linear approximations of these curves. Let me explain. Here you're looking at the inboard and outboard transom lines as lofted. We're going to zoom in on a small region in this lofting. Our purpose is to see how the plank joinery will interact with these lines. So what you're seeing here is just the portion of the plank ends that land on the bevel of the transom. Now I've colorized two of these plank ends so that you can better see the different features of the planks. The light tan portions are the cross sections of the planks on the inboard side, and the golden triangles are the top edges of each plank. The important thing to observe here is that the top edges of the planks are triangles because those top edges are diminishing down to a feather's edge thanks to the dory laps. So what's key to laying out the transom bevels is seeing how in this diagram the inboard face and the outboard face of the plank ends deviate slightly from the actual transom bevel lines. You can see this more clearly if I clear away the planks. The red and blue lines are the inboard and outboard transom lines as lofted, whereas the green and orange lines are the approximations. These are the lines that you actually need to derive in order to cut the transom bevels. Let's see what that looks like in practice. So here we're looking in on how exactly I went about deriving these lines in situ. You can see that I have the lining batten in position, and this is important. It's a very useful tool here. To connect this back to the previous diagram, I'm going to superimpose all the operative lines here. So you have the inboard and outboard transom lines as lofted, and then the approximations that we're trying to derive. So let's see how I went about deriving these lines. First, in order for this explanation to make sense, you have to imagine that we can see through the transom. So there on your right, you can see the outline of the previous plank as it dives into the transom, landing on its respective bevel. The layout of the inboard line hinges on the existence of 2 points, where the top edge of the previous plank intersects the inboard transom face and your lining off mark for the top edge of the next plank. Now, for the remainder of the layout, we're going to need 3 important projection lines. These 3 lines will essentially describe the top notch of the transom bevel. So here's where those lines come from. First, I project up a line to the inboard and outboard faces of the transom that is parallel to the edge of the lining batten. I also made sure to project a connecting line to the outside edge of the transom. This connects the inboard and outboard projections I just made with the straight edge and guided me when I was making the stop cut for the top of the bevel. The most critical part of the inboard layout is what I'm calling the gain offsets. These are the little zigs and zags in the inboard transom line approximation that correspond to the dory laps. I found that 1/8 of an inch to be a pretty good approximation of what these offsets needed to be, but sometimes I had to tweak that. With the offsets figured out, you can go ahead and draw in the inboard line, and notice that the topmost offset runs along the inboard projection line. Now, the most important thing you need to figure out for the outboard layout is how deep the bevel needs to be. Theoretically, this is given by the outboard transom line as you lofted it, but it's good to double check this by measuring the gap between the transom and the lining batten on the inboard face. This measurement can then be transferred to the outboard face of the transom along the projection line. So finally, to draw the outboard line, you simply connect the points between the outboard intersection of the previous plank and the bevel depth as measured. So the most important thing for this layout to work, at least in my opinion, is that the inboard and outboard lines end up being basically parallel with one another. What this means is that the plank end will not have to twist within the transom bevel, ultimately benefiting installation. Finally, for comparison, here is the inboard and outboard lines as lofted. Then it's just a matter of cutting the transom bevel out. And so with all the bevels cut, we're ready for spiling. So that's episode 18. I really hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for the next and final installment in this planking series, where I'll be going over the spiling process, how I installed the planks, and how this project has a new home in rural Virginia. Now don't forget to like and subscribe to Neophyte Boatwrights, And if you're feeling so compelled, please, please, please consider becoming a patron on my Patreon page. Making these episodes, as you can imagine, is a Herculean effort and takes a lot of time. So whatever support I get really keeps me going. And on that note, I wanted to give a shout out to 2 new patrons. Much thanks to Andres Durstenfield and Robert Byron Ellis Jr. Thanks! Bye, see you next time.